Welcome everybody. While people are trickling in, it's great to have all of you with our first VDEV of the spring semester. I'm very happy to have Gabriel Ulyssea with us. We will be talking on kind of regarding new work with Clement Imbert, who's also with us, and we will be answering some of the questions in the Q&A. For those of you who are familiar, you know the rules of the game. For those of you, this is the first time for VDEV. Gabriel will be talking for 45 minutes, and then there will be 15 minutes of Q&A afterwards. During the 45 minutes, feel free to, and you're encouraged to post any questions in writing in the Q&A. Clement will try to answer those. We'll also see whether there's some of them that we bring to Gabriel, that I bring to Gabriel orally. And then after the 45 minutes, we'll open the mic, and so you can raise your hands and ask further questions directly. If we don't get to one of your questions, don't be upset. We're doing our best, but we have also seen the slides in advance, and so sometimes there's questions that we know will be answered, so we'll postpone those. Needless to say that this is meant to be a friendly seminar, so inappropriate behavior will not be tolerated. The seminar is being live streamed and will be posted on YouTube, so you can also tell colleagues afterwards to find it on the VDEV website. Without further ado, Gabriel, thanks very much for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you so much for the invitation. So Clement and I would like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to present our work. We are delighted. This is part of, start sharing my screen. This is part of a broader agenda that we've been working together. So we're quite excited to be able to discuss this first paper, this first project, which is entitled Rural Migrants. And I'll start my timer as well. Rural Migrants and Urban Informality, Evidence from Brazil. So Clement, as Karen mentioned, Clement is here to answer all the tough questions you might have in the chat. And so let me get started. So the motivation for this work starts very broad. So urban population in developing countries has been growing quite substantially. So between 2015 and 2020, it grew by 12.5%. Is projected to grow by another 65% almost until 2050. So that's massive numbers. However, we also know that these countries are also characterized by low firm growth, and there's now extensive literature documenting that and also analyzing the determinants of this low firm growth, but also high informality, sometimes living together with high unemployment or high underemployment, and that's particularly true amongst young workers. So, of course, the big question then that looms large in the background is like, will these economies be able to generate enough good jobs to accommodate this fast-growing urban workforce? To add to the mix of complexities of this phenomenon, rural-urban migration still accounts for a substantial fraction of population growth in urban areas in developing countries. And the dominant view, and that was certainly true for us as well coming into this project, still stems from the seminal work of Harris Todaro and also Fields that essentially predicts that rural migrants, once they arrive at urban destination, urban labor markets, they either join the pool of the urban unemployed, so they queue for formal jobs, or they join the informal sector and take up informal jobs. That wouldn't be a very promising prospect for the question above. And indeed, like recent evidence seems consistent with this view, at least in the short run, and this will be quite important for everything that we discussed today. So there are like papers showing that upon arrival, inflows of migrants in the following year, for example, tend to lead to higher unemployment and or higher informality. However, the Harris Todaro Fields framework, to hold in its most usual form, it requires quite strong assumption. In particular, it requires perfect wage rigidity in the formal sector, which is very unlikely to hold in the longer run, even if you have minimum wage policies and a minimum wage that binds in the formal sector. Also, immigration often represents a sizable labor supply shock, and this is, even though might be a trivial point, is a key one, because it can actually lead or induce potentially large effects on firm dynamics, in particular via firm entry. So if you're familiar with the startup deficit literature in the US, the argument there is the opposite of that. Actually, so essentially there is a slowdown in entry rates in of firms in the US. And this has been associated, or one of the main determinants of that, has been pointed at the slowdown in labor supply coming from the slowdown in demographic growth. So, and that leads to lower entry rates on the firm side, lower dynamism in the formal and in the labor market. So this would be kind of the opposite that one could get in face of a large labor supply shock. And then finally, a very important point that, you know, in the Harris-Todaro-Fields framework, the formal and informal sectors are highly disjointed. So this is very much akin to the dual view of informality or the dual view of economic development. However, more recent evidence suggests that in most urban labor markets in developing countries, actually there's no evidence of duality. Formal and informal sectors are highly integrated, in fact, which means that even if migrants are first absorbed in informal sector jobs, this could lead to higher dynamism in the formal sector. So because informality can be often an elusive concept, let me provide you with two definitions that will be present throughout this presentation and throughout our paper. The first one is the extensive margin of informality, which is whether entrepreneurs register or not the business. And then you have the intensive margin, which is whether firms that are formally registered in the first sense hire formal or informal workers. So the intensive margin would be formal firms hiring informal workers. And just to give you a ballpark of the magnitude of what this represents in terms of shares of total informal employment in countries in Latin America for which we have the data, this can vary between 35 and 40% of all informal workers located in formal firms. So this is quite important. Now, of course, like this can, there are like the usual, perhaps, if you're familiar with the topic, negative consequences of informality. The first one, the most trivial one, perhaps would be tax avoidance, because these firms and workers do not comply with taxes, meaning that hinders the ability, for example, to provide public goods by the government. It can also lead to misallocation of resources because informal firms are typically smaller and less productive. This is what, for example, allows them to fly under the radar, so to speak. So that provides them with a cost advantage relative to formal firms. And this can induce misallocation of resources. And of course, informal workers, back to the idea of good jobs or stable jobs, informal workers do not have job stability, do not have unemployment insurance. They are not covered by Social Security from the employer side. So there are many dimensions in which informal jobs can be considered worse. However, informality also, by the same token, can provide de facto flexibility for firms and workers to cope with adverse shocks or positive shocks like a labor supply shock. It can also be a stepping stone for firms into the formal sector, so they can enter in the informal sector, build up their productivity, and then graduate into the formal sector. And it can work also as an employment buffer in times of bad shocks. So what do we do in the paper? The broad question that we asked is, what are the labor market and aggregate effects of rural to urban migration in urban destinations? And I'll emphasize destinations in all points here in the slide, because we are not looking at the overall spatial equilibrium, including the effects of the rural in rural areas from that are sending these migrants. So we are really focusing on urban destinations. So we proceed in 3 steps to answer this question. The first one is we implement a shift hierarchy design to identify the causal effects of immigration at destination in Brazil. So what do we find? In terms of labor market effects, and very much to our surprise coming into this project, because again, I think we were very much influenced by the Harris-Todaro-Fields framework, we find that places that receive more immigrants actually observe an increase in formality and a decrease in informality. There is a decrease in wages for both formal and informal workers, and no effects on non-employment, meaning that the increase in informality that we observe is really shifts from informal to formal jobs. Then we move to look at what happens to formal firms dynamics, because we only have panel data for formal firms. What we see then is that an increase in the number of formal jobs, an increase in the number of formal firms, and this is also being accompanied by the higher entry and higher exit in the formal sector. So there's higher entry overall, and naturally there's more churn. There's more firms entering, there's more firms exiting. The effects on entry are slightly higher. So to further rationalize this result and also understand more of the aggregate consequences and mechanisms, we develop a model of firm dynamics with both margins of informality that I just mentioned, and also heterogeneous growth profiles across firms. And I will discuss that in more detail when we get there to the model part, but like essentially the heterogeneous growth profiles is a key feature because it allows the informal sector to play the stepping stone role that I just mentioned in the previous slide. We then estimate the model and perform counterfactuals to assess the equilibrium effects of migration at destination. For us here in the model, migration would be really a labor supply shock. And then we can analyze the effects of this labor supply shock as it is, with more or less enforcement, meaning like the government being more or less active in curbing informal activities. And also to speak to the Harris-Soldado-Fields framework, with and without wage rigidity in the formal sector. In terms of the contributions, these are 4 areas that we think we're contributing. First, in terms of the rural-urban migration and urban labor markets literature, both with the theory and the evidence, we show that rural-urban migration actually can lead to lower informality and an increase in formality. So our framework encompasses this very flat, rigid structure in the Harris-Soldado-Fields, but it allows for different frameworks for understanding these effects. And of course, on the evidence side, we show a decrease in informality. We also speak to the literature on labor market frictions in developing countries. This is a very broad literature, but especially the experimental side of it has been focusing on the frictions that prevent job seekers, in particular young job seekers, to find better jobs, where better is usually formal or stable permanent jobs. Here we actually take a different route, and we show that labor supply shocks can, in equilibrium, create formal jobs. So we focus on firms and analyze these equilibrium effects. We also relate to the population growth and firm dynamics literature in the US. So this is very much US centered. And as I mentioned already, they are trying to understand the slowdown in entry rates of firms there by looking at the evolution of demographic growth and labor supply growth. And our finding here are the mirror image of that. So we actually have labor supply shocks inducing more entry into the formal sector, more dynamism in the formal sector. And we provide a new model of formal and informal firm dynamics, and also the first piece of evidence, to the best of our knowledge, in developing countries. And then finally, immigration and firms, which is more extensive in developed countries, but it's been expanding in developing countries. And here we very much focus on aggregate effects and the role of informality and firm dynamics. So this is the outline for the remaining of the talk. I'll talk you through the empirical analysis and results. Then I'll have 2 slides on the model. Due to time constraints, I will not go into the details. And then model estimation and counterfactuals. So let me get started with the empirical analysis. So we use different data sources throughout the paper. For the IV shift chart estimation, we use data in these 3 main areas. The first one is migration labor market outcomes. For that, we rely on the decennial population census in Brazil from 91 to 2010. So 3 waves of the census. 2010 is the latest one. Like, there's been a delay, but now hopefully next year we'll have the 2022 one. So this provides us with our main variable of interest, with the inflow or the immigration rate into all urban municipalities in Brazil. Migrants here are measured as those who arrive in a given location in the past 10 years. This measure has the disadvantage that we are not able to capture step migration or temporary migration, but that's a common constraint in this type of data. We'll focus here on migration to urban areas, which is 88% of all migration, and cross-state migration, so which is 40% of migration into urban areas. The decennial population census also provides us with the complete framework, network of migration between every municipality to every municipality in Brazil. So and we can map this in these different years. So this will be provide us with the shares in our shift share instrument. And I'll talk more about that in a second. For firms, we have 2 main data sources. The first one is the matched employee data, which is administrative data from the Ministry of Labor in Brazil that covers the universe of formal firms and formal establishments and the workers. So this is the highest data set. You might have seen it in different papers. It's been extensively used in recent years. And then also we have matched employer-employee survey data on small firms in Brazil up to 5 employees. So this is a very unique data because it was designed to be representative at the country level, at the national level, of all firms up to 5, all businesses up to 5 employees, formal and informal. But when they went to the field, actually, they surveyed not only the business owners, but also the employees of that business. And they asked both employees and the owners the formality status of the business and of each one of these employees. So this allows us to measure not only the informality share for firms in this universe, but also the intensive margin of informality, meaning the share of informal workers within formal firms. Unfortunately, it's not representative at the municipality level, so we cannot use it to do the same analysis that we do with the census, with the decennial population census. And then finally, there is the data that we use to construct the push shocks. Our main push shock would be price shocks, or crop price shocks. So we use international information on price of crops, of the main crops grown in Brazil, combined with the crop shares at the municipality level measured in the agricultural census of 1980. So this measures each municipality exposure to variation in international prices of the commodities that they grow. An alternative push shock that we will use would be the drought the spade drought index, which is at the monthly level. So we can combine that with the growing season by crop, by region, to see of the main crops in each municipality, when's the growing season, and that's when they are most, the drought will be most damaging to that particular location. We can construct a drought index at the municipality level. So these two push shocks are measured at the origin level for all municipalities in Brazil. So in terms of the empirical design, it's quite simple. If you've seen this particular type of design, we'll focus on first difference regression. So you can see here, we'll focus on decadal changes of the outcome of interest. It could be the share of informal jobs, share of formal jobs. The main regressor, the main endogenous regressor of interest would be the immigration rate accumulated between 2001 to 2010. So it's over the decade, the fraction of immigrants into a given location, normalized by population in the baseline year, which is 2000 for us. And we also include a basic demographic, social demographic controls at destination measured in the baseline year of 2000. So whenever we're looking at worker level results, we have to draw on the demographic census. And therefore we look at changes between 2010 and 2000. When we look at firm outcomes, we rely on the highest data set. And because for some small municipalities, the entry or exit of formal firms can be a quite noisy outcome, we average pairs of years, because here we have annual data. So we have 2011, 2012 average, 99, 2000 average, and we take the difference of that. And in terms of the basic controls, and we do a lot of robustness exercises, and I'll show you in a second, we use share of male, share of young, and high skew, where high skew in everything that I say will be completed high school or more in 2000. Then our instrument for the endogenous regressor immigration rate will be the shift share instrument that I already alluded to. So the shares here will be the fraction of migrants from a given origin to all potential destinations in Brazil, multiplied by the price shock or the drought shock at origin. So in terms of the destination, each destination is more or less exposed to shocks at different origins, depending on the previous networks of migrants, and previous meaning the previous decade networks of migrants, or the intensity of migration from all possible origins to any given potential destination. So these shares of migrants from origins to destination are our shares. Our shifters would be the price shock. Our main results focus on the price shock, and we also use the drought shocks as a robustness exercise. Finally, because the highest data set is available annually to us, we can look at dynamic effects for firms' outcomes. So for that, we hold the baseline year period fixed, which is 99 and 2000. You can see it here. And then we do pre-years going back to 97, 98, and all the way to 2017, 2018. Okay, and that's our dynamic effect for firms. If there are any questions, I can take some in terms of the design. Otherwise, I can discuss the results.
I think but maybe there's a question from Alessandra Tarozzi that Clement's answering, but maybe you can give a quick answer asking whether the fact that this is migration from rural areas of the same country relevant for what you're doing, and is that part of how it distinguishes it from a broader literature on the impact of immigration on destination?
So of course, the fact is internal migration, some of the issues that arise in international migration are not present here. So there's no cultural, I mean, there are cultural differences within Brazil. It's a big country, but not as big as you would get with international migration. There's no language barrier, so on and so forth. Some of the issues, nevertheless, are present, like there is still stigma, for example, against rural migrants and so on. So many of the things that you would expect to see and many of the issues that arise in international migration are present still here. And in particular, these aggregate effects also have been discussed in the context of international migration in receiving countries as well. So I think this is broader than just looking at internal migration in terms of some of the, especially these aggregate effects. Now, of course, you have to, I'll mention a little bit about the composition effects at destination of these immigration flows. And this is a key feature to understand effects at destination. If these inflows are from high skill individuals or low skill individuals, that plays a massive role, for example. We cannot speak much about that here, but just a thing to keep in mind in terms of this broader question. But thank you. Okay, so let me jump into the results, okay? So first is the results on workers at the individual level. And these were the results that really surprised us, again, as I mentioned already, coming into this project. So first highlighting here the effect, so you can focus on panel B, which is the IV results. So 1 percentage point increase in the immigration rate in a given destination, which is about 14% of the standard deviation in immigration rates, leads to an increase of 0.4 percentage points in the share of formal workers at destination. So that's about 2.1% increase in the share of formal jobs. We were expecting actually the exact opposite. We were expecting a decrease in the share of formal jobs. And you can see that it's really coming from a decline, a substantial decline in the share of informal jobs. Total wage employment, if anything, increases, but it's completely statistically insignificant. So there's really a reallocation from informal to formal jobs. If you look at columns 4, 5, and 6, you see that there is a decline in wages that hits both the formal and informal sectors, which is consistent with both a labor supply shock, but also there can be composition shifts occurring between the two sectors. I alluded to the compositional effects here. One very important characteristic of our setting is that these immigration flows are not changing the skill composition at destination. So they are neutral from a skill composition perspective. So they are not inducing a massive shift towards low skill workers, for example. So that's quite important. What's happening in terms of workers observables is that they induce an increase in the share of males and the share of young workers, which is typically the population that it migrates internally in particular. Now, perhaps because of that, when we look at these effects by skill level, the effects are there for low skill and high skill workers. So it's not, these effects are not concentrated in low skill workers alone. Okay, so that's also linking back to the previous question in terms of how to understand these results. These are key things to keep in mind. Then we were quite surprised by these results, and then we moved to look at the effects on formal firms. We wanted to understand what was happening in the formal sector. And here you can see on column 1, panel B, that 1 percentage point increase in the share of immigrants leads to an increase of 2.4% in the number of formal firms. This is accompanied by an increase of 2.2% in the number of formal jobs, and a decline of 3.4% in the average wage that these firms pay. Looking at entry and exit, you see that this higher immigration is also associated to a greater number of entrants in the formal sector, but also a greater number of exiters. And that's not, so there's greater churn, but the effects on entry are slightly higher. And this is natural. When you see more entry, you should expect more exit as well, because now you have firms and more firms entering. Some of them will be good, some of them will not be good, and some of them will not survive and should exit. In that, this is leading to a higher number of formal firms. Now, there are a number of hyperlinks here that I probably shouldn't shouldn't open each one of them if we want to get through everything on time. But let me tell you what's going on in terms of the story that each of these hyperlinks is telling. So first of all, the first thing that comes to mind is like, perhaps the migrants are the ones creating these firms. So like there's a lot of research done in terms of investigating immigration and entrepreneurship. So this is not what's happening here. So we don't have individual level data in terms of linking migrants into formal business creation, but we can look in the census and see whether migrants are becoming more present in firm ownership and business ownership, and this is not happening at all. And we can look by firm size, and this is not even happening in very small businesses up to 5 employees. So it's not the case that these migrants, or it doesn't seem to be in the data, that these migrants are the ones creating these businesses. In terms of the composition of industries, these effects are concentrated in the non-tradables, which is again also perhaps expected or intuitive at least. So jobs and firms, the composition of jobs and firms is shifting away from manufacturing and into services and retail and construction. So this is intuitive for a number of reasons. First of all, these are also the sectors that are more likely to benefit from the demand shock brought about the arrival of these migrants. So these non-tradables. Second, construction is a sector that traditionally absorbs migrants, so networks could be playing a role here. But also services and retail and construction require general skills or low levels of skill, in contrast with manufacturing that could perhaps rely on more specialized skills that these migrants would not bring, at least upon arrival. So that makes intuitive sense. In terms of firm size, again, like these effects are concentrated in small businesses, up to 5 employees. So it's not the big businesses expanding and growing or entry of bigger businesses. It's really focused on the shift is towards smaller business. And then we don't have productivity in our data, but we can, for example, construct proxies for firm quality and firm productivity. For example, the average firm wage paid by the firm throughout its lifetime to all workers, or fixed effects, or do a cluster analysis of different characteristics that could be associated to firm quality. It doesn't matter how we do it in the data, we systematically find this increase in the number of formal firms is concentrated in the middle and bottom of the quality distribution. So it's not the most productive firms that are entering and prospering because of this labor supply shock. Instead, is the firms this is concentrated in the middle bottom quartiles of the quality distribution of firms. And in terms of dynamic effects, perhaps I can show you this one here. Okay, I shouldn't have done that. There's something happened here. I apologize. Okay, I've seen all the slides, but in terms of the dynamic effects, essentially we don't see we don't see the effects diminishing over time. If anything, these effects that I'm showing here get a bit bigger going all the way to 2018. So these effects are not fading out. And looking at pre-trends, we don't find any evidence for pre-trends. Okay, so this is what the graph showed. I apparently chose the wrong hyperlinks. Okay, so in terms of robustness, we did a lot. So this is one slide, again, to convince ourselves that we had solid results, because they were quite surprising to us. I typically joke that this is one slide worth 1 year of work. So we did a lot here. So we check for pre-trends, as I mentioned, but we also include lag changes in the outcomes as control. Nothing changes. We test for different potential confounders. We control for population, industry shares, log GDP per capita baseline, driving distance to the capital, and all of these potential confounders, and results remain largely unchanged. Another concern would be that our shares in the shift share instrument could be capturing the persistent effects of migration. So on top of it, we control for the lag migration rates, and again, results remain the same. Another concern here could be that our shock prices are also capturing demand shocks at destination, if destinations are also specialized in or highly affected by international crop prices. So we control for local price shocks, but also a weighted average of the prices in neighboring municipalities for each destination, where the weights are given by distance to control for this potential demand channels, and nothing changes. Another exercise also, you might have seen a recent paper by Imbert et al., where they document that the drought shocks induce capital reallocation in Brazil in response to these drought shocks. So it could be that our price shocks, and certainly our drought shocks, could be capturing also capital reallocation rather than these immigration flows, and what we are interpreting as the effects of immigration could be actually the effects of capital being reallocated across space. So what we do is we reconstruct the bank network as they did, and we use that as a share, and then we combine that with our shocks to different origins, and we include this as a control in our regressions to make sure that this is not the channel driving our results, and results remain unchanged. And then also, as I mentioned already, we use a different push shock, because one thing that could be happening here is that these effects are actually specific to the shocks that we are looking, the price shocks and the municipalities that they are affecting, and the pair of origin destination municipalities that are affected by these shocks. So this would be less general of a result in a sense. So what we do, we construct this drought shock that I mentioned already, and we use that as our to construct our instrument. Of course, there is some overlap between them because they're mostly affecting rural areas, but the overlap is far from perfect. If I remember correctly, the correlation is 0.3 on this ballpark. So there is some overlap, but actually they're affecting quite different regions, these two shocks, and we find the exact same pattern using the drought shock or the price shock. So this is reassuring in terms of our effects not being driven by particular sets of compliers in these pairs of origin destination municipalities. And finally, we implement the Ulyssea-Kohl-Haravel framework, the inversion approach, to estimate our results using their method, and results remain unchanged. So at this point, I'll migrate into discussing the model. So maybe it's a good point to receive some questions.
Yeah, Clement has been doing a great job, but there is a number of different questions around whether the results are driven by, whether you can say anything on whether this is the migrants or the natives in terms of the formal employment and some of the other results. I'm not sure that's possible, but even if not, kind of how you're thinking about it.
No, it is possible. We actually, in fact, do it separately only for natives, and the effects are there, but also the migrants are benefiting. So we see the effects on both groups. I don't know if that's the only question, or if there's another one, or should I move on?
I'll let you move on. I mean, there's many other questions, but that way we have time afterwards for the...
Okay, great. Thanks for the questions. Keep them coming, or keeping them in reserve perhaps to the end. Okay, so let me now give you a gist of the model and then discuss the counterfactual simulations. Okay. In the interest of time, I completely almost made a model session free of equations and math. So let's see how that goes. Okay. But essentially, I'll give you an overview of the main mechanism of the model, and then if you're interested, I'm happy to chat in the Q&A after. But then, so in this model, there's a continuum of firms indexed by their individual productivity, theta. So you can think of a firm level TFP or a Higgs neutral productivity component. We'll make the assumptions in some very stark assumptions to keep this very simple. So we'll assume that all firms here have the same technology. They use labor as the only input to produce. They operate in the same industry and produce homogeneous goods and are price takers. So this perfect competition. So this is the most extreme version of similarity between formal and informal firms, or formal and informal sector. You can tweak this in different directions, and they would be reasonable changes. For example, you could assume if we were to have capital here, you could assume that formal firms are more intensive in capital or have cheaper access to capital. All of this would be reasonable extensions, but we really want to focus on the trade-offs that are driven by regulations and enforcement. Okay. Now, of course, this has implications for the quantitative results that I'll show you in 2 slides. So bear in mind that in terms of, for example, productivity effects of reallocation from the informal to the formal sector, probably what we have here is a lower bound of these effects, because there are no intrinsic technological differences between the formal and the informal sector. Okay. In terms of the trade-off that is the regulations and enforcement induce, Informal firms, they face lower entry costs because they don't have to comply with all the entry regulation that exists and the red tape that exists to create a formal firm. They face lower regulatory costs because they don't have to pay taxes. They don't have to comply with the cost of filling their tax returns every year. But they face an operation cost that is increasing and convex in their size, meaning that you can interpret this as a probability of being caught that increases with your size. The bigger you are, the more visible you are to the government. If you want to take a broader perspective on this, you can think that the opportunity cost of being an informal firm increases with your productivity. Because the more productive you are, the bigger you want to be. You want to have a broader customer base. You want to issue receipts, invoices. You want to be part of government procurement bids, and like you cannot do that if you're informal. In terms that immediately gives you a declining probability in or a declining share of informal firms by firm size, which is exactly what one sees in every single data set that I know. Now, in terms of being a formal firm, you face the full regulatory cost, the full regulatory burden. You pay higher entry costs, you pay revenue taxes, you pay payroll taxes, but you don't have the increasing cost in your firm size. So because like now, actually, the marginal cost is constant for you because it's essentially given by the wages and taxes. However, formal firms in the setting can evade labor regulations by hiring informal workers. However, you cannot do that also if you're too big. Again, think about Apple. Like it would be, it's very hard for Apple to hire informal workers because it's too visible to the government. It could have a reputational cost of being caught hiring informal workers and so on. It's a dynamic model and a key. The firm dynamics is key to understand the results here. So there is endogenous exit, meaning firms can decide to exit any given period, but there is also an exogenous death shock that hits firms at all periods. These death shocks are different between the formal and informal sectors, and they are estimated from the data, but like what we get is a higher death shock for informal firms. So even though there's no technological difference between formal and informal firms, formal firms have this benefit of a lower exogenous exit probability, which makes their discounted value of being operational in the formal sector higher than the informal sector for the same firm with the same productivity level. So there's no difference in technological technology, but there's this difference in the level of values. There are no aggregate shocks. We assume homogeneous labor, and this is important because, of course, you could think that going back to one of the first questions, migrants here could be different than the natives. We're making this, again, a stark assumption that labor is homogeneous, but also very much in line with what we find in the empirical part, because there's no change in the skill composition at destination, and also the effects are homogeneous across workers. And the labor supply is fixed in the model. So the immigration is really an increase, an once and for all increase in the labor supply in a given destination. Now, I mentioned that the key feature of the model is firms dynamics, and it's driven by the firm's productivity process. So all the dynamics here are at the firm level, not at the aggregate level. And in particular, what's key here is that firms will differ not only in terms of their current productivity, which is denoted by theta, but also by their long-run productivity new. So before entering, firms learn what's the new, what's their long-run productivity. And then they form an expectation of what's going to be if they decide to enter in the formal sector, and what's going to be if they decide to enter the informal sector. Because firms with high new are more likely to have a high productivity draw as soon as they enter. So you can look at it here. Firms with a high long-run productivity will self-select right away into the formal sector because they expect to be productive and they expect to be big. Firms with a low new will self-select into the informal sector because they expect to be small and therefore doesn't pay to enter the formal sector. They enter, they learn the actual productivity, which is the theta 1 expression highlighted here, which is their long-run productivity plus this shock. That creates already like this heterogeneity in growth profiles, because some firms will have a high new, but a very low first draw in theta. And the other way around, like some firms will have a high theta compared to their new. So that creates heterogeneity in the growth profiles across firms. And then in period 2, this is a very familiar AR1 type of process. You've seen like the dynamic panel on employment processes. This is on the underlying productivity process. So it's an AR1 with a firm-specific intercept, where the intercept is given by this long-run productivity parameter nu. So that creates this heterogeneity, which is interesting because then the two margins of informality can have a positive effect, because it allows firms to build up their productivity and then migrate to the formal sector. It allows for firms with high nu but like low theta in a given time to endure low negative shocks by downsizing, hiring formal workers until their productivity recovers. So that's the model in 2 slides. And then what we do here in terms of estimation, we use a 2-step simulated method of moments. So in the first step, we do a system GMM using the panel data, firm panel data from in the formal sector to estimate the productivity, the persistence in the productivity process of formal firms. For the statutory, for the taxes and some other institutional parameters, we use statutory values instead of like estimating it within the GMM. We take those as given, and then we go to the second step and estimate 12 parameters using the simulated method of moments. We use 15 moments to match these 12 parameters. We have a lot of slides on one slide on estimates and a lot of slides on model fit. I can assure you that the model, please take my word for it, the model actually has a great fit to the data. So like, of course, the targeted moments are well matched. That's not surprising, but we'd also look at different untargeted moments and including moments never used in the, many moments never used in the estimation, and the fit is quite good, even though it's a relatively simple model. And I'm happy to talk more about the reasons of that. In terms of counterfactuals, we have a simple, the simplest one, which is an immigration shock, which for us here is a labor supply shock, a once and for all 10% labor supply shock, which is around the 80th percentile of immigration rate. So it's a sizable shock. Then we do immigration plus the Harris-Todaro-Fields scenario, which is wages in the formal sector perfectly rigid. Of course, this is a bit ad hoc in the sense that it's not an equilibrium outcome in the model because it's artificially, the wages are artificially fixed in the formal sector. And then we do immigration plus enforcement, that is government intensifying enforcement in the extensive margin to understand if the government responds by increasing enforcement, would it be able to reap greater benefits from these immigration inflows? So jumping to the results in terms of labor supply shocks, the first 2 lines is the share of informal workers and the share of informal firms. We don't have the share of informal firms as an outcome in the reduced form analysis, but the effects on reducing informality of workers, it's very much in line with what we find in the reduced form. So like that was reassuring to us that the model would exactly replicate what we find. In terms of the increase, in terms of what's happening with the number of formal firms, we also find this increase in the number of formal firms after the labor supply shock. If you look at the line above, you can see that wages are declining by basically 3%. Now, what's interesting in terms of the, which is very much in line again with our reduced form results, something that we cannot see in the data, but here we can look directly at is average firm productivity. So the composition of firms active, total output and tax revenues within the framework of the model. So you can see that total, so productivity barely changes. And this is the net effect of 2 different forces that I'll comment in a second. You can see that total output increases, which is not surprising because you're increasing resources in this economy, like you're increasing the number of formal workers. However, because of the nature of, and I'll show you a picture in a second, like it's the worst firms that are benefiting from this shock, the increase in output is not by 10%. So like output per worker is actually declining in this economy. However, tax revenues are also increasing by 7%. So in terms of productivity or the composition of firms, this is what's happening in terms of quartiles of firm productivity in the formal sector after the labor supply shock. So you can see in line with what we find in the data, there is a reallocation from the top quartile to the bottom and middle and bottom quartiles of firm productivity. So this is within the formal sector. So the composition of firms in the formal sector is worsening, even but on the one hand. On the other hand, there is a shift from the informal to the formal sector, which improves also the composition of active firms in the economy, leading to this almost no effect that I showed you here in average firm productivity. Now, let's look into the Harris-Todaro field scenario. What happens, which is what I think implicitly we had in mind coming into this project, and perhaps many of you also before seeing our results. If we force wages in the formal sector to be rigid, which could be the case if, for example, the minimum wage is binding and we're looking at short-run effects of a labor supply shock, you do see a very sizable increase in the share of informal workers and also in the share of informal firms. The mass of formal firms compared to the labor shock without rigidity, which is column 2, the number of formal firms actually declines because, of course, like now you have wages in the informal sector declining by more than 15%. So now it's relatively cheaper to operate in the informal sector than in the formal sector. The decline in the mass of formal firms is not larger because some of the formal firms, the least productive formal firms, benefit from this declining informal wages because they are hiring formal workers themselves. And you can see like now there is before we were like the model had no wage gap between the formal and informal workers. Now there is a 15% wage gap between them. And in terms of aggregate effects, this rigidity, of course, does not lead to positive results in the sense that this average firm productivity declines by a lot more than the simple labor supply shock. Output increases still because production is increasing in the informal sector, but it does by less than the scenario without rigidity, and tax revenues decrease because informality is increasing by a lot. And now with the 30 seconds that I have left, let me show you the final exercise, which is what happens if the government reacts to this labor supply shock, to this arrival of immigrants by being stricter with the informal sector. So cracking down on the extensive margin of informality. Unsurprisingly, informality falls by a lot. However, it does at the expense of displacing many informal firms, which I'm not showing here, but like actually the number of active firms declines by a lot. Average productivity actually increases because you're killing so many low productivity informal firms that in the end, like the composition overall improves, but the composition in the formal sector worsens. In terms of output, actually you observe a higher increase in output compared to the baseline and compared to the simple labor supply shock. And same thing with taxes, because now informality has declined substantially. So in terms of the dividends that you can reap from labor supply shock, they seem to be higher if you increase enforcement, but it comes at the cost of displacing many informal firms. So let me recap, and also I don't explode my time. So I hope that you're convinced that immigration actually can lead to an increase in the share of formal jobs, a decline in informality, an increase in the number of formal firms and formal jobs. And this is very much in contrast with the common narrative that rural job migration would necessarily increase informality or underemployment or even unemployment in developing country cities. And so like our results suggest that actually these urban economies can experience demographic dividends in general, but in particular in the form of internal migration. And the counterfactors that I just discussed with you, first of all, confirm our reduced form analysis, but they also show that the gains from this labor supply shock do not go to the most productive firms. Output per worker decreases, so that's the less shining part of the story. And but increasing enforcement and therefore reducing informality could increase the dividends from these immigration shocks. And once you impose wage rigidity, and in particular, if you have a binding minimum wage, in the short run, you can still expect to have the Harris-Todaro fields type of results with higher informality and lower output gains. So that's it. Thank you so much. And I'm happy to take questions, I guess, now.
Great, Gabriel. Thanks a lot. So if you want to ask questions live, which we encourage you to do, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you. And while people are raising their hands, there was a question by Laura Contreras-Portela that may be good to kick off. It's a context question. So she's asking, to what extent is it illegal to be informal in Brazil? That's what the cost of informality suggests. Moreover, is it credible that informal firms don't have access to the formal credit market?
So
that and then we'll open it up.
So it's not a criminal offense. It's not, but it's not legal in the sense like the relevant regulations, labor or tax regulations. So if you're caught, so there are no costs to workers, to be clear, of being or working informally. All the costs accrue to the firms, and the firms are liable to pay fines and eventually close if they're caught multiple times. Now, in terms of the other part of the question.
How difficult is it for them to get access to credit?
How it's very so they cannot get you need a tax identifier number to access as a business bank account. You can access it as a individual, but not as a business. Without this tax identification number, you cannot export, you cannot access government procurement and so on. So it's quite costly in that sense.
Right. Giacomo, go ahead.
Hi, Gabriel.
Hi, Giacomo.
I have a couple of questions. One is a bit of a, I guess, standard one in the sense of, the reduced form IV instrument. I'm guessing it's going to pick up effects for people who migrate only because they have a network in a given place. And so, I mean, in a sense, that seems to suggest that these migrants are going to be selected from the lower tail of the distribution. Which is something you don't seem to find in the way you're interpreting it. And I wanted your feedback on that. And the other point/question I have is, in the experiment where you have, let's say, full enforcement of just some banning informality, the issue there, I guess, is that it's very hard to understand what that policy is. Right? So in a way that will come, if it is feasible, will come with enormous cost from the government side. So, and then it becomes a little bit harder to understand what is the true counterfactual there. Thanks.
No, great. Karen, should I collect more questions or?
Go ahead, and then let me
just
flag Rajesh. I think you had a question. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you. So then you're next. Go ahead, Gabriel.
So in terms of we can speak of in the data. We can speak about the observables that these workers have. So in terms of, as to the extent that excluding captures part of the skills, we don't see any. So essentially, they don't change at all, like the composition at destination. They're very much like the composition of the migrants is very much in line with the skill composition at destination. Of course, in terms of the unobserved skills, it's hard to say anything more concrete. These are big shocks. So whether at origins, so whether this is inducing the migration of the least skilled at origin or the more skilled at origin, this is more skill bias or less skill bias in terms of the origin distribution, I cannot say. We have looked at the result. We have looked at the effects in terms of the selection compared to the origin, the skill of the of individuals at origin, and it completely slips my mind. I don't know if Clement remembers. We looked at this a while back, so I should know off the top of my head, but I don't.
Just a stupid suggestion, just the weight distribution at origin, right? So that would be a way to look into that.
Yeah, we could look at the wages that we don't. So it's not a panel, so we cannot look at wages before they leave. We can look at wages that they make at destination and compare to the wages that other people make at origins, and this will incorporate the gaps already. But we can do that for sure. And we did look at the distribution of observables comparing the migrants versus the stayers at origins. And that's what's sleeping. And I should have off the top of my head, and I apologize.
Sorry, so we're comparing them to the average migrant. So the shocks, right? So that we've done this. So how does the shock change the selection in terms of how does the marginal migrant compare to the average migrant? And there we did not find much in terms of skills, which is one thing we can measure a bit consistently. I guess we could do the wages they earn at destination, and that's not something we've done.
No, but that's a good thing to do as well to complement that. In terms of the enforcement, how to interpret the enforcement exercise, I agree with you 100% in the sense that, so the way that this is a parameter, like I can tell you in the model what it is. It's a parameter that makes the cost of operating the informal sector steeper. How in our minds we map this to policy? That would be a very costly policy of putting a lot of inspectors in the street, knocking on doors and kind of taking everybody off the street. Or closing down informal businesses. This has a huge operational cost, like in terms of resources, and also political costs. That would be massive. So rather than actually interpreting as a policy, something that can inform actual policy cost benefits, I rather think about it as like shedding light on the role of the informal sector in shaping the effects that we see. Because I don't think, I agree with you that this would be a policy that will have enormous costs to implement, even without disregarding political costs.
Thanks. Rajesh, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, just a quick clarification more. Given that when you think about say India or Sub-Saharan Africa, where rates of informality are almost touching 80%. So I was just wondering, what's the time frame in which you run your counterfactual? Say, if you think about a 10% increase in labor supply, and how much that changes, say, the share of informal firms by, to kind of mentally think about a timeline of change that we might be thinking about if, let's say, the goal is to move towards informality being really on the margins and in an economy.
No, this is a great point. I should have mentioned this. So there's no time frame in the sense that we're comparing steady states in the model. So one key thing, for example, here would be to have some potentially important thing would be to have the transitional dynamics between steady states, so we can actually answer your question, see how that evolves period after period, so 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years, because that would be a key input for the policy decision, or how to think about these effects in a more concrete context, because this will inform, for example, if someone takes action. But that's true also, like in terms of the informality counterfactual without migration. How long do the benefits take to materialize versus the potential costs? And I think that's a key. A potentially key issue. In the data, we're able to examine year-by-year effects, and what we see actually is that the effects kick in, but these are relative effects, not aggregate effects. So, but still, like the effects kick in 2010, and they never recede. So, like they stay, like firms, the number of firms stay high, the number of jobs stays higher almost permanently. It doesn't decline at all. Whether this is like the exact timing, we cannot speak to that in our paper, unfortunately.
Maybe a quick add-on question. Do you have any sense on whether this is results are driven by the big cities or by the small kind of? Yeah.
No, this is a great question, something that I didn't have time to comment. So we do by GDP per capita at baseline. So we look at terciles of GDP per capita at baseline, and it's coming from the bottom, or the bottom middle. So it's not the big urban municipalities with mature labor markets at all. It's more these places that were in the middle and lower bound of the income per capita distribution, which is interesting, again, thinking about, because there is the average GDP per capita in the upper tercile is 3-4 times larger than the GDP per capita in the bottom. So that is also speaking to kind of the external validity, if you want to understand like this in other contexts. And I should have mentioned this to the previous question as well, because it's young workers, male, who are migrating into cities, and these cities are not the most developed ones. These are the least developed ones, actually.
Great. Wait, Garance, go ahead. We're almost out of time, but so you'll be the last one.
So I was curious, in your model or when you simulate it, what are the key parameters that the model rely on, in which, if they are different, then you get very different patterns.
So there are a couple, because we have, okay. So in terms of key parameters is the cost functions of both margins of informality, the extensive and the intensive margin of informality. How steep these curves are key to determine this trade-offs between the informal and informal, because they inform you how big you can grow in the informal sector before it becomes too costly, and also how many informal workers you can hire as a formal firm before it becomes too costly. So these are two, and these functions are governed by one parameter each, and these are quite important ones. And then also the exogenous exit probability, the gap between the formal and the informal probabilities is quite key, because it governs the average difference, let's say, in payoffs between the formal and the informal sector. So this is also quite key. And then you have parameters that govern the size distribution of firms that are well disciplined by the firm size distributions and the growth patterns that we observe in the data. So these are, but I would say the key ones are the ones that I just mentioned before, that will determine a lot of the costs and benefits of the informal versus informal.
Thanks.
Of course.
Thanks, Gabriel. Thanks, Clement, for kicking us off the semester. A fantastic start. Gabriel and possibly Clement, I don't know, will be available in the Zoom room that I just posted. If anybody wants to follow up on further discussion or potentially ask other things. We will see you back in 2 weeks when we have the next VDEV with Kelsey Jack from UC Santa Barbara. Thanks, everybody. Good to see you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Oh, you're muted, Karen.
Thank you. I want to make sure you guys have the questions. Mark, can you share the questions in the Q&A with
perfect, yeah.
Clement and Gabriel?
Thank you.
So it's scheduled for in 10 minutes. Clement, you're more than dismissed. Thanks so much for.
You're more than dismissed.
You've been great. Thanks so much. I'll be here.